We are lucky enough today to have Elaine Mills as our speaker. She's probably one of our most experienced and dedicated speakers. She became a master gardener in 2012 and quickly developed a special interest in sustainable landscaping and created the first set of fact sheets on tried and true native plants. These are a very popular resource on our Master Gardener of Northern Virginia website if you haven't run across them. She has spent the past 12 years growing native plants and photographing them, as you can see on this beautiful slide. In the past, she served as a coordinator of one of our demonstration gardens, but recently took on the really large job of chairing our public education committee. And we'd like to welcome you today, Elaine. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Colleen. And a huge thank you also to Annette behind the scenes, who has done a lot of work preparing definitions for the many technical terms I'll be introducing during the course of today's talk. So welcome, everyone. I'm hoping this talk will give you a little advanced taste of spring. We'll begin by discussing the characteristics of ephemerals and the evolutionary adaptations that they have made in order to ensure their success. Then I'll be introducing 23 native species. Because I'm speaking from Virginia, I began looking at species that are native here, but I know that many of you are attending from elsewhere. So a good number of these will be native beyond Virginia. We'll be briefly discussing threats to these plants and then present some tips on garden design and care. Finish up with some resources at the halfway point, and then at the end, I'll be happy to take any of your questions. The term ephemeral means quickly fading, and it certainly applies to these plants. They have a short life cycle and grow only during favorable periods. An example of ephemerals are desert plants that will only come into bloom with a period of rain. But today's plants are those that emerge from underground early each spring. They quickly bloom and produce seed within about a 2-month span of time, and then their foliage will wither, leaving only their underground structures. As an example, here in Northern Virginia, Mayapple, Podophyllum peltatum, begins emerging in late March. Flowers will have developed by mid-April and fruit by mid-May. And in the early days of July, the foliage will already be withering. Now, even though their life above ground is brief, these are perennials and they will return from dormancy each year. More specifically, these particular ephemerals are geophytes, plants with underground storage structures. Technically, they may be known as corms, rhizomes, tubers, or true bulbs, but they are generally referred to generically as bulbs. They pass through a warm, cold, warm sequence in their annual life cycle. During their period of above ground growth in the spring, they will send carbohydrates from photosynthesis to enlarge those underground bulbs. They'll go through a period of summer dormancy, and then cooler fall temperatures will be a cue to them to begin producing stems, leaves, and flower buds within the bulbs. This, of course, is an onion bulb, not an ephemeral bulb, but it gives you the idea that these structures are already forming. Then these plant organs developing through the winter will give ephemerals a head start to spring growth. In nature, spring ephemerals are found in the understory of our deciduous forests, and they will emerge from protective leaf litter and grow rapidly in the early spring sunlight. Because they form chloroplasts, those organelles within leaves that contain chlorophyll, and they also will have their photosynthetic proteins activated at low temperatures, they can attain a high photosynthetic rate, allowing them to bloom before trees begin to leaf out fully in the canopy. There have been a number of adaptations of these plants. They generally are small, less than about 18 inches, and they have shallow root systems. This allows them to take advantage of the thawing forest floor, which begins thawing at the upper layers before moving down. And that way, they can absorb water and nutrients before the larger plants begin to do so. In addition, ephemerals have what are referred to as mycorrhizal associations. These are symbiotic connections between their plant roots and networks of fungi underground, and these facilitate the uptake of these important resources. In addition, ephemerals have various physical adaptations. For example, some species of hepatica have fine hairs that insulate their stems as a protection from frost. The flowers of bloodroot will emerge enfolded by leaves to protect them from cold temperatures. And plants such as spring beauty have flowers that can close at night and on cloudy days to protect their pollen from cold and rain. Ephemerals are pollinated by early emerging insects, and those that have nodding flowers will especially draw these insects that are cruising along the forest floor. Some plants have very special relationships with very specific pollinators. For example, queen bumblebees are a perfect pollinator match for Dutchman's breeches. They have the ability to fly in cold weather. They have the strength to open the petals of these flowers, and their tongues are long enough to reach the nectar. Plants like trout lily are visited by bees referred to as oligolectic or pollen specialists. That means that they can collect only the pollen of certain genera or even very specific species of flowers in order to provision their nests. And ephemerals have special relationships with ants, a process referred to as myrmecochory. Their seeds have attachments referred to as elaiosomes that are rich in lipids and proteins. The ants will collect these, feed the elaiosomes to their larvae, and by that means the seeds will be dispersed and spread throughout the forest away from parent plants. So we'll begin now taking a look at some of the spring ephemerals. And I invite you at this point to refer to the handout. This was sent out with the Zoom link, and it will be available on the website along with the recording. You'll note that there are links from the named plants, and these will go either to the fact sheets that Colleen has referred to, the tried and true fact sheets on our Master Gardeners of Northern Virginia website, or to reputable resources such as North Carolina State or Missouri Botanical Garden. For each of the plants, we'll have an introductory slide with this text box. You'll see that I've noted the native range. For Virginia, it tends to be the mountains and the Piedmont, but because I have visitors attending from other regions, I have gone to the trouble of researching the entire native range of the plants, so you'll be able to see whether they might grow natively in your own state. Most of the plants, as I've mentioned, are going to be small, and almost all of them will grow in part to full shade and prefer moist, rich, well-drained soil. Therefore, I won't necessarily be repeating these facts for each of the plants. I'll tend to highlight just the characteristics that are unique to them. I also want to show you what the flowers, leaves, and fruits look like, and I include slides that indicate how you might use them in your landscape. So let's begin with bloodroot, Sanguinaria canadensis. This particular plant gets its name because the rhizome exudes a reddish sap. This is found throughout a good part of eastern North America, from Canada all the way to Florida and west to Texas. The flowers, as I've mentioned, are enfolded by leaves as they emerge. The blossoms have 8 to 16 petals, and they will bloom from March to April. They close at night or during cloudy weather. They don't produce any nectar, but the bees are attracted to their pollen, and the flowers, when they're closed, can self-pollinate if there aren't sufficient insect visitors. Bloodroot has palmate leaves. That means that the lobes are like the fingers of the hand radiating out from one point, and the edges of those lobes are scalloped. Of course, this plant will begin to go dormant by midsummer. And here's a look at the elongated seed pods. The two photos on the side showing the cutaway of the seed pods illustrate very clearly how the eliosomes are attached to the seeds for dispersal by ants. Bloodroot will form quite sizable colonies in shady areas, and of course you'll want to combine that plant with other shade-loving plants to fill in when they die back. Our next plant is twin leaf Jeffersonia diphylla. This particular plant grows all the way from New York to Georgia and Alabama, west to Minnesota. It reaches 9 to 18 inches tall and tolerates heavy shade. Because the flowers are fragile, you'll want to plant this away from competition and protect it from wind. And additional protection can be provided by adding summer and winter mulch to protect the rhizome. Twin leaf has an interesting characteristic. Its leaves will begin to fold at sunset and remain folded at night. This is thought to be a protective mechanism in order to avoid the loss of moisture and perhaps to protect the plant from herbivory from rabbits and deer. Twin leaf gets its name because its single leaves are divided deeply into two lobes that give the impression of being two separate leaves. It's rather like the spread wings of a butterfly. It has short-lived cup-shaped flowers from March into April, and these produce pollen for bees, but the plant can self-pollinate by closing at night. The fruit is a pear-shaped lidded pod, and the ants will spread their seeds. Twin leaf spreads vegetatively as a seasonal ground cover and will go into decline by mid to late summer. This is particularly nice to use in shaded woodland gardens with other woodland species such as creeping phlox and native violets. Spring beauty, Claytonia virginica, is named for an early botanist, John Clayton, who was active in Virginia in the 1700s. This is found all the way from Nova Scotia to Georgia and west to eastern Texas. It's common throughout Virginia, except in the far southwestern mountains and the eastern shore. It's a smaller plant, 6 to 12 inches tall, and interestingly, it can grow in a full range of exposures all the way from full sun to full shade. It grows from a structure referred to as a corm. This is a rounded structure that grows underground. Spring beauty has narrow paired grass-like leaves, and these will already be fading by late spring. Its small star-like flowers bloom from March to April with very prominent dark pink nectar guides for bees. And spring beauty has a special relationship with the pollen specialist bee, spring beauty bee. When pollinated, the flowers will produce seeds in these ovoid seed capsules, and the underground corms that look something like ginger can be harvested as a spring meal. Of course, if you do that, the corms would not remain to produce flowers again the next year. These so-called fairy spuds have rather a taste of radishes when they're eaten raw. When they're cooked, they taste either like baked potatoes or have something of a chestnut-like flavor. Spring beauty spreads by bulb offsets. Those are daughter cells that form away from the original corms, and it can also spread by self-seeding. It's lovely to use in rock, wildflower, or woodland gardens, especially when interplanted with ferns and other spring wildflowers. And you can allow it to spread naturally in a lawn. There are two types of hepatica in our region. Both are native to eastern North America. Hepatica americana grows in the mountains and Piedmont, and Hepatica acutiloba more just restricted to the southern mountains in Virginia. Round-lobed hepatica, true to its name, has 3 rounded lobes to its leaves, while sharp-lobed hepatica may have as many as 7 leaves. You can see that they're both fairly small. They tolerate somewhat dry conditions, but be alert that sun will damage the leaf edges. They have leathery basal leaves, and these may be mottled. You'll note that these two plants have evergreen foliage, but they still tend to be grouped with other ephemeral plants. Round-lobed hepatica, as I mentioned earlier, has solitary flowers on these silky-haired stalks, and these will bloom from March to May. What appear to be petals are actually white, pink, or purple sepals. These are structures that function to protect the flower bud before it opens up. And you can see very prominent the pale anthers, the male part of the flower. These will attract sweat bees and flies, but like some of the other species we've mentioned, they are self-fertile. Sharp-lobed hepatica flowers from March to April, and its sepals are pink, lavender, or white, and its stamens are yellow. New leaves to refresh the evergreen leaves will emerge after flowering begins. And both these species are especially effective when used in large sweeps, either in woodlands or in shady rock gardens. Dutchman's breeches, Dicentra cucularia, grows all the way from New England to Georgia, west as far as North Dakota to Oklahoma. A smaller plant, 6 to 12 inches tall, it likes the moist, acidic, neutral soil and is intolerant of wet winter soil. It's rabbit resistant, moderately deer resistant. Be alert that it is toxic if ingested. Dutchman's breeches begins growth from a basal rosette of fern-like foliage, and then will develop waxy white flowers from March to April, looking something like pantaloons. The upside-down blossoms help to protect the pollen from wind and rain. The seed capsule will mature from a yellowish green to a blue-green, and then the seeds will be spread by ants. As mentioned earlier, Dutchman's breeches is pollinated by early emerging bumblebee queens, and then the plant will become dormant by midsummer. It's best to allow this to spread in woodland gardens. It's especially attractive when interplanted, for example, with Allegheny spurge and ferns. And here's a look at interplanting with mayapple. Squirrel corn, another Dicentra, Dicentra canadensis, grows all the way from Canada to Georgia, as well as having a presence in Tennessee and Missouri. It's named for the yellow underground tubers that help the plant to spread. This is relatively deer resistant, and again, all parts are toxic. Squirrel corn has feathery fern-like foliage that goes dormant after bloom, and lavender-tinged flowers, heart-shaped, that offer pollen and nectar. These also are pollinated by bumblebees as well as butterflies. The seed capsules of squirrel corn are somewhat flattened ovals, and they will split in two in order to release the seeds. Those seeds are spread by ants, and the tubers may be collected and spread by mice and chipmunks. This is a nice plant to use in woodland or shade gardens. Wild bleeding heart, which has similar heart-shaped flowers and fern-like foliage, is related. It's also in the Dicentra genus, but it is not an ephemeral. Its foliage will last on into fall. Cutleaf toothwort, Cardamine concatenata, grows throughout the entire eastern U.S., every state that's east of the Rocky Mountains. It's found mostly in the mountains and Piedmont in Virginia. Fairly small at 6 to 9 inches tall and wide. It grows from jointed rhizomes, which have tooth-like projections, and this led to the original scientific name, Dentaria laciniata. Cutleaf toothwort is the larval host for the West Virginia white butterfly. Unfortunately, it is frequently displaced by an invasive plant, garlic mustard. Both of these plants are in the mustard family, and butterflies will sometimes be attracted instead to the garlic mustard. They will lay their eggs on the plant, but then the resulting caterpillars will not be able to use the foliage to fuel their nutrition. Cutleaf toothwort has a whorl of 3 leaves. These are sharp-toothed, and the petals, 4 in number, are arranged in the shape of a cross. That's very typical of mustard family members. These bloom in April, offering nectar for bees, and the plant will spread to form colonies, good for use in woodlands or shady rock gardens. Rue anemone, Thalictrum thalictroides, again is found through a good part of the eastern U.S. Another small plant at 6 to 9 inches. This one is fairly hardy, will tolerate hard spring frosts, drought, and heavy shade. You'll want to wear gloves when handling the underground structures. Its flowers appear in April with petal-like sepals, offering pollen for bees and flies. There is a pink-flowered rosea cultivar. 3-lobed leaves resemble the herb rue, and the basal foliage is arranged in whorls. Nice for use in woodland or shady rock gardens. Of course, it will go dormant in the summer. Virginia Bluebells is perhaps one of the most familiar of the spring ephemerals. Mertensia virginica is native from New York to North Carolina, west to Minnesota, Arkansas, and Kansas. It's a little taller at 1 to 2 feet tall and a foot to 18 inches wide. This one differs in that it grows in moist to wet soil, although it's intolerant of wet winter soil. It will tolerate rabbits as well as black walnut, and deer seldom severely damage it. Virginia Bluebells begins its growth. The basal foliage emerges in March with a distinct purplish cast. This will mature to green as it grows into big floppy leaves. The flower buds are arranged in coiled clusters, something like a scorpion's tail. Bluebells have multicolored buds that mature generally to a light blue, although you may see color variants in a large colony from pale pink to white. The plant blooms for about 3 weeks in April, attracting a wide range of pollinators, including butterflies, moths, and hummingbirds. And then you'll see these 4-lobed fruits in summer. Virginia bluebells grow natively en masse in moist woodlands. Here it's pictured in the floodplain adjacent to the Potomac River. It's also nice to combine the plant with other non-native spring bulbs or hellebores, and it will self-seed to form fairly dense seasonal colonies, but it's best to interplant them with ferns and ground covers to fill in when they die back. Yellow trout lily, Erythronium americana, is named for the mottled leaves that resemble the markings on brook trout. This grows from Canada to Georgia and westward, mostly in the mountains and Piedmont in Virginia. It's fairly small, 4 to 6 inches tall and wide, and it also, like the spring beauty, grows from corms. Deer, unfortunately, may consume the leaves. You'll see these leaves in early spring, and then a single flower stalk will rise from the paired leaves. The flowers will appear from March to May. They're nodding, and they have strongly reflexed petals. That means that the petals are slightly bent back on themselves. Yellow trout lily can spread to form seasonal ground cover, and the colonies may actually be fairly long-lived. You can allow it to spread in woodland gardens or use it beside streams and shady rock gardens. May apple, Podophyllum peltatum has been named the Wildflower of the Year for 2025 by the Virginia Native Plant Society. It's found in the eastern U.S. west to Nebraska and Texas and is common throughout the entire state of Virginia. It grows about 1 to 2 feet tall, is 9 to 12 inches wide. It tolerates drought but dislikes competitive plants. The leaves, unripe fruit, and roots are poisonous. The ripe fruit is edible, avoiding the seeds. The fruit has a lemon-like flavor. It can be eaten raw in limited amounts or can be used prepared in jams, jellies, or marmalade. The leaves emerge, as I mentioned, either late March on into April in very tightly wrapped pleated spirals. And as they unfurl, they're palmately lobed and shaped like umbrellas. The upper surface is mottled and the leaves can measure up to 12 inches across. The flower buds will appear in the axils of two-leaved plants, in the fork between those leaves, and they are single, nodding, waxy flowers, blooming from April into May, attracting long-tongued bees. This fleshy fruit, rather lemon-shaped, appears in May, provides a wonderful food for box turtles, and it will be yellow and soft when it's ripe. The leaves begin to fade as the fruit is ripening. So you'll want to combine May apple with filler plants like ferns, Allegheny spurge, or Solomon seal. It's best to use in deciduous woods as opposed to under conifers. Do we have any questions at this point in the talk, Colleen?
We do, Elaine. There was a question about when is the best time to transplant ephemerals?
I'll be talking a little bit more about planting and transplanting later on, but I can mention just at this point that I'll be discussing the pros and cons of planting either in the spring or the fall.
Okay, great. And I wanted to mention to people, I meant to say it at the beginning, that any of the pictures that you see that are unattributed, it means Elaine took them. And they're all gorgeous, as you can see. I didn't really understand this question, but someone asked something about whether it blooms on 1 or 2 leaves.
Okay, the one plant where it's very particular is mayapple, Podophyllum peltatum. Let's just back up here. It's going to bloom on 2-leaved plants. Those plants that just have a single leaf will not have the bloom. It grows right here in the axil of those 2-leaved plants.
How would you source these wildflowers without digging them from unauthorized, protected places?
Well, that's a very important point, and I'll be getting to that when I talk about the threats to the
Okay.
ephemerals. Let's look at the second group of spring ephemerals, and we'll begin with Canada anemone, Anemone canadensis. True to its name, it does grow throughout Canada, and it has an interesting range just in the upper 2/3 of the United States, west as far as Montana and even New Mexico, but not at all in the southeast. In Virginia, its native range is limited to Fairfax and Rockingham counties. This grows 1 to 2 feet tall, about 2.5 feet across. It's important to protect this from wind. Flowering may decrease as the clumps become crowded, and another one to protect from toxic sap. There is another plant, Anemone virginiana, known as thimbleweed, that grows in this area, but it is not an ephemeral. Canada anemone grows from a basal clump of very deeply dissected leaves. Here's a look at the buds in May. The upward-facing flowers lack petals. What appear to be petals are actually sepals that protect the flower in the bud stage. Bees are the main pollinators. The name anemone comes from the Greek word for wind. Obviously, it doesn't have to do with wind pollination because the bees are the pollinators. It refers to the wind dispersal of the seeds. And the seed head is what is referred to technically as a cluster of achenes. These are dry, one-seeded fruits. They don't happen to split open to grow. Canada anemone is very attractive, planted in moist areas, especially near streams or ponds. It is a plant that can spread aggressively in ideal conditions, so you might want to use some kind of barriers to control the spread or to divide it frequently. There are two types of bellwort I'll be mentioning. The first is perfoliate bellwort, Uvularia perfoliata. This is found in the eastern United States from New Hampshire all the way to Texas and is common throughout the state of Virginia. It grows 8 to 20 inches tall. The young shoots can be eaten as a substitute for asparagus. And unfortunately, I found conflicting information on the plant's deer resistance. The plant gets its name because it has smooth perfoliate leaves. That means that the stem appears to be piercing or growing through the leaves. You'll see what is referred to as palmate venation. The veins are all radiating out from one central point. The flowers are dangling. They'll appear from April to June. They're solitary, and what appear to be petals are, in this case, referred to as tepals. This is a term used when it's difficult to distinguish between petals and sepals. These plants are pollinated by native bees that come seeking nectar, and they have a warty inner surface with orange papillae, something like the bumps on our tongues. This particular bellwort has a three-angled fruit capsule from June to August, and it ripens from green to brown. Bellwort spreads by stolons. These are runners that spread horizontally on the surface of the ground, and they can root at different points along the way to form new plants and therefore end up resulting in a whole colony. This can be used in either shade or woodland gardens. Our second bellwort is large-flowered bellwort, Uvularia grandiflora, found from Vermont to Minnesota, south to Georgia and Oklahoma. It's found in the mountains and somewhat rare in the Piedmont in Virginia. This is a little taller, 18 to 24 inches tall. It tolerates dry soil as well as drought, and the rhizome is edible when cooked. Unfortunately, deer may severely damage the foliage. Here's a look at the new shoots emerging and the somewhat drooping leaves. They are also perfoliate. The flowers are distinguished from those of the previous bellwort in that the tepals are twisted, and these attract many native bees. The plant can spread by rhizomes to form colonies. Unfortunately, heat will cause dormancy. And it's nice to use en masse in woodlands or shady borders. Our next plant is Eastern Shooting Star, Primula media, found from Pennsylvania to Wisconsin, south to Georgia and Texas, and in scattered sections of the mountains and the Piedmont in Virginia. This plant was formerly known as Dodecathion media. It grows 9 to 18 inches tall, tolerates gray soil, and prefers to grow on slopes. It's important to keep this plant evenly moist during the time of its above-ground growth, but you want to avoid wet soils in the winter. It begins its growth from a basal rosette, an arrangement of leaves out in kind of a star-shaped form, and it has a nodding arrangement of anywhere from 8 to 20 buds on a tall leafless stalk. These are arranged in what's referred to as an umbel, where all of those separate stalks grow out from one point. The flowers have distinctly reflexed petals. Eastern Shooting Star blooms in April, And very interestingly, it is pollinated by queen bumblebees that use a technique referred to as buzz pollination or sonification. They are able to vibrate their thoracic muscles at a very high rate, as many as 100 times per second. And this vibration is what releases the pollen from this particular flower. The rosettes may develop offsets over time. It's nice to use in woodland gardens. And this particular garden used ferns, hellebores, hostas, and celandine poppy as accompanying plants. Star chickweed, Stellaria pubera, grows from New Jersey to Illinois, south to Florida, and Alabama. It's found in the mountains and Piedmont and rarely in the coastal plain in Virginia. It grows 6 to 12 inches tall, spreading to 1.5 feet across. The young leaves can be eaten raw, cooked, or added to salads with a taste something like spinach. There is an alert to use caution when consuming them due to the saponins. These, however, don't tend to be retained in the body. They tend to pass through without causing harm, and they can be further broken down by cooking. Star chickweed has both fertile and infertile shoots, and these will put on a growth spurt after flowering. It has star-like flowers with 5 deeply cleft petals that make it look as though it has 10 petals. And these flowers attract bees and other pollinators. The leaves are finely pubescent with downy hairs, and they serve as a larval host for butterflies. The plant can grow in very rocky locations, as you see here. It's also well suited to shady wooded areas where it will form small colonies. Here's the first of several trilliums I'll be discussing. This is great white trillium, Trillium grandiflorum. This has a native range from Maine to Minnesota, south to Georgia. It's common in the Virginia mountains, but rare in the Piedmont. It's the largest and showiest of the trillium species. It grows 6 to 18 inches tall, has very long-lasting flowers. Unfortunately, deer tend to browse both the foliage and flowers of trillium, and Trillium grandiflorum is unfortunately a favorite. This plant has a whorl of 3 glossy bracts. Bracts are modified leaves, and these have, as you can see, parallel veination. These primary veins have the parallel veins. And these bracts will serve as a larval host for moths. In fact, bracts can function something like leaves. They can photosynthesize, but just not at quite the same rate that true leaves would. Trilliums get their name both because of this whorl of 3 bracts, but their other parts are in multiples of 3 as well. You'll see the 3 petals, here they're white, 3 green sepals, and the reproductive parts are also in multiples of 3. This particular plant provides nectar for early emerging native bees in April, and you'll see the flowers fading to pink over time. The seed capsule clearly depicts the seeds with the eliosomes that are attractive to ants who will disperse them. Great white trillium spreads slowly by rhizomes and is excellent for use in shady borders and woodland gardens. Toadshade, Trillium sessile, grows from New York to North Carolina, west to Nebraska and Oklahoma, and in scattered sections of the mountains and Piedmont in Virginia. It grows 6 to 12 inches tall. All of the trilliums tend to need consistent moisture, and again, deer may browse. Trillium cuneatum, little sweet Betsy, is a plant with a similar appearance, but it is bigger, it has larger flowers and broader bracts, and tends to be more prevalent in the southeast. Toadshade has 3 whorled and mottled bracts that function like leaves. It will bloom from March to April, It is called sessile because it has stalkless flowers. They are attached directly to the bracts. You'll see here the 3 spreading green sepals and the 3 upright maroon petals. And these petals will elongate with age. Toadshade is nice to mix with wildflowers and ferns in a woodland area. It's not recommended to use this plant in perennial borders. Our next trillium is yellow trillium, Trillium luteum. This is native to the Smoky Mountains, so it has a very narrow range: Tennessee, Kentucky, North Carolina, and Georgia. It has naturalized in Frederick and Fairfax counties in Virginia and has also escaped and naturalized in Maryland and Michigan. This trillium again is a little taller, 8 to 18 inches tall. It again has a whorl of 3 mottled bracts serving as larval host to moths, and a sessile flower with a lemony fragrance that appears in April. Here you see the twisted yellow petals above the 3 green sepals. This offers pollen and nectar for pollinators, a good plant for woodland landscapes. This particular trillium is especially long-lived, up to 25 years, and it will spread slowly by rhizomes to form a colony. Red trillium, Trillium erectum, grows from New England to Illinois and Michigan, south to Georgia and Alabama, and its range is limited mostly to the mountains in Virginia. It has 2 other names: wake robin, because it appears around the time of the return of the robins, and stinking Benjamin because of its fetid odor. Red trillium grows about 10 to 12 inches tall, 6 to 12 inches across. It's cold hardy but sensitive to heat. It has ovate, rather diamond-shaped bracts, serving as a larval host for moths. And here's a good look at the 3 maroon petals and 3 green sepals. This plant doesn't offer any nectar, but it does attract, because of its fetid odor, flies and beetles. Here's a look at a white-flowered variant. A fleshy, berry-like fruit develops, and this, like the other trilliums, is nice to use in woodland areas. This very dramatic flower is yellow lady slipper, Cypripedium parviflorum. This has quite a wide distribution in North America, all the way west to the Rocky Mountains, even as far as Alaska. It's not, however, found on the far west coast nor in the southwest. This is a native orchid, 12 to 18 inches tall. The recommendation is to grow it in part shade, either open shade or on the north side of a house. And there are other recommendations to plant on compost-amended soil, to spread the roots out horizontally on the top of the soil, but to cover the roots in compost. Unfortunately, this is a favorite of deer. Yellow lady slipper blooms in late spring, attracting many pollinators, and the slipper portion of the blossom is about 2.5 inches long, and the lower lip has red spots inside. Burgundy-colored upper sepals twist outward in spirals, and it has hairy leaves with parallel veins and will form colonies over time. Nice for use in a woodland garden. And our last spring ephemeral is marsh marigold, Caltha palustris. This grows 8 to 12 inches tall, a foot to 18 inches across. This has a slightly different preference as far as sun exposure. It can grow in full sun to part shade. It prefers wet, humus-rich soil and can even grow in standing water. The seeds can be dispersed by rain, and they have a spongy coat to allow them to float and spread. This is deer resistant because of the acidic foliage, and for that reason you would want to wear gloves when handling it to avoid skin irritation. It's important not to confuse this with invasive lesser celandine, which can grow in similar conditions. These plants have elongated tepals to the flowers. Marsh marigold has glossy heart-shaped leaves, and they provide a nice shelter for frogs. The sepals have UV patterns on them that insects use as nectar guides. They attract both syrphid flies, these are either flower flies or hoverflies, and other pollinators because of the nectar and pollen. The seeds of marsh marigold are eaten by birds and chipmunks, and as I mentioned, it's nice to use in water or bog gardens or at pond edges. At this point, we'll briefly discuss some threats to our ephemerals, as well as providing some tips on landscaping and care and giving you some final resources. Phenology is the study of cyclic cycles of plants and animals, and studies show that spring geophytes are especially sensitive to climate change. Warm fall temperatures will delay the period of dormancy. Winter warming negatively affects the development of all those parts within the bulb. And seedling emergence is also jeopardized by the absence of a cold period. Unpredictable frost and flowering can result in both decreased pollination for the plants and possible starvation for the pollinators. When the bloom times change, native specialist bees are especially at risk, and unfortunately, 25% of our eastern U.S. bees are pollen specialists. Further threats from climate change are a result of the effects of heat stress and drought-induced dieback. The shortened flowering periods make seed production difficult, and there's a reduced time for storing nutrients for future flowering. In addition, invasive plants that can border our native ephemerals benefit highly from the warmer temperatures and the higher CO2 levels. Additional threats to ephemerals come from invasive plants. I've mentioned lesser celandine, Ficaria verna. This tends to emerge very early and may draw insects away from the natives, outcompeting them. It can spread quite invasively under the ground, and it's important to dig up every little part of the root system to prevent its spread. Norway maple is an example of an allelopathic plant. It exudes particular chemicals into the soil that inhibits the growth of other plants. And I've also mentioned garlic mustard, which can distract butterflies with misleading chemicals away from native mustard family members to the garlic mustard, and when it's mistaken as a larval host. Additional threats to ephemerals result from the loss of habitat with urbanization, deer overpopulation, and human scavengers. Here are a few tips for designing with spring ephemerals. It's nice to combine these plants in naturalistic, informal groups in woodlands rather than arranging them in straight lines. You might also use them under a deciduous tree that gets eastern sun exposure. You'll tend to see a more effective appearance when you plant them en masse in randomized patterns. And you can do this as you might with non-native bulbs. Some people like to take a handful of the bulbs and give them a toss and then plant them wherever they land in those random locations. Of course, you'll want to plant other perennials to fill in the gaps as these ephemerals fade. Some gardeners find it helpful to use markers when they first begin using them to help locate the plants after dieback. It can be nice to accompany our ephemerals with other flowering plants that have persistent foliage. The example shown here is woodland phlox. You see the purple flowers, and then here's the foliage that will continue on as a nice ground cover surrounding the trilliums. Other examples might be Allegheny spurge, our native violets, Jacob's ladder, foam flower, or Virginia waterleaf. And I have provided links to these plants as well as the ephemerals on your handout. Ferns, of course, are wonderful as accompanying plants as well. The fern pictured here is maidenhair fern, very unusual in the arrangement of its fronds in a horizontal fan-like pattern, and it also has these very distinct wiry black stalks. Christmas fern is an evergreen fern. Lady fern has very attractive reddish stems. Ostrich fern, of course, is very dramatic, quite a bit larger than the others. And marginal wood fern is another evergreen fern. As far as caring for spring ephemerals, many people who grow native plants may be interested in trying to grow the spring ephemerals from seed as well. But the alert is that many of these are difficult to grow from seed you've collected. The seeds are small, they have low viability, and in addition, they may have complex germination requirements. They may need special storage, and many of them require cold stratification. In addition, if you were to buy them, they could be expensive. And in fact, the seedlings are slow to mature and take as many as 7 years before they begin flowering. Instead, the recommendation is to plant seedlings. Now, the underground structures for these will differ, as I've mentioned. Some of them grow from corms. You see them pictured in the hand in the photo on the right. Examples of those are spring beauty and Dutchman's breeches. Some, like squirrel corn or toothwort, grow from tubers. Here's a look at the squirrel corn. Trout lily grows from bulbs. And bloodroot, Virginia bluebells, and the bellworts grow from rhizomes. Some of these particular underground structures will be sold as what are referred to as bare root plants. They're available in their dormant stage, and they will arrive bare root, not surrounded by any soil. Spring ephemerals are best planted either in the early spring or the fall, and there are pros and cons to both. Of course, in the trade, you'll tend to see them more available in the spring when there's actually some foliage to be seen. Planting them in the spring allows them to go through that period of photosynthesis and send that good energy to be stored in the bulbs. Just an alert that the plants may not flower in the first year. In the fall, you can take advantage of the fact that soil is still warm, and planting at this point will allow that important bulb development going on into and through the winter. It's important to site these, as you've seen on each of the slides, in rich, well-drained acidic soil. And by well-drained, I mean a soil that is not going to be boggy during the winter, because these underground structures will begin to rot out if the soil is overly moist at that point. You want to site these ephemerals where they'll receive late winter sun, but will be shaded later on. It's important to avoid planting on the north side of the building or under evergreen trees or shrubs. The soil will not receive enough of the warm sun to facilitate the growth. You also want to avoid planting in garden beds where there will be repeated digging. As with the non-native bulbs, you want to plant these bulbs about 2 to 2.5 times their depth. So this could mean anywhere from 3 to 6 inches deep, depending on whether you're planting a small corm or one of the larger forms. And you would tend also to plant them about 3 to 6 inches apart, again, depending on their width. As we've mentioned multiple times, it's a good idea to wear gloves to protect your hands because some of them have a toxic sap. You can extend the life of some of the large-leaved plants like the bluebells or the May apple by providing more moisture, but eventually they will all fade during the summer. The bulbs themselves can withstand drought during this period of summer dormancy, but you'll want to provide moisture for that important fall growth underneath the ground. You can mulch spring ephemerals with finely shredded leaves, but no fertilization is required. Older plants can be divided during the period of dormancy after their leaves have faded. You would gently dig them up, divide them, and then replant them. You would cut either the corms or the rhizomes. It's important to have pieces that have roots and new growth to allow the new plant to form. And you could break apart offsets in order to replant. As we've mentioned, it's very important not to collect any of these plants from the wild. You don't want to harvest them. Instead, purchase them from reputable native plant nurseries, preferably those that are not using the neonicotinoids. You can also choose local ecotypes. These will be especially adapted to local environmental conditions. And because of those long-standing relationships, especially with the pollinators, they're going to provide the best support for local wildlife. Choosing local ecotypes also helps to maintain important genetic diversity for our native plant populations. On your handout, I've provided links to a range of different sources for plants. Here in Northern Virginia, we often refer to the website for Plant Nova natives. Those who are elsewhere in Virginia could refer to two websites, either the one for Plant Virginia natives, which has separate brochures for each of the regions of Virginia, as well as the website for the Virginia Native Plant Society. And Maryland, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania also have native plant societies with specific sections on their websites to tell you where to purchase native plants. I've also provided links to two sets of videos that I think you might find interesting. The first is available on our MGNV website. It's a close discussion of 25 species by our regional naturalist, Alonso Abugadas, who is the host of the Capital Naturalist blog posts. Another excellent selection is on the Virginia Native Plant Society website. It's a fuller discussion of 100 species, including references to historical, medicinal, and edible uses. And a final link that I've provided is to a very interesting article on the role of temperature in the flowering of geophytes. Do we have any final questions at this point, Colleen?
One person asked if you could talk a little more about lesser celandine and how to distinguish it from natives.
Yes, as I mentioned, the tepals are a little bit longer. Those are what appear to be yellow blossoms. Let's see if I can go back to that slide. Just get back there quickly. The leaves are shiny like those of the marsh marigold, but you can see that these have more of a heart shape and they're larger. And these, of course, are going to be more in clumps, whereas the lesser celandine just is packed in very tightly like this. And of course, should you dig them up, those underground structures will be distinct.
Okay, great. You had talked about Canada anemone. Someone else asked if meadow anemone is the same, and they're finding it very aggressive in their garden.
Many of our plants have different common names. And I have to say that I didn't particularly note that meadow anemone was an alternative name for this one. But the fact that it's being described as aggressive leads me to believe that it may be the same plant. I usually take time to provide what I refer to as an addendum document, which I will send out to everyone attending the talk and make available later on the website for any questions that I don't answer fully today. So I can double check on that identification and provide a fuller answer to that question.
Do you have any specific recommendations for someone who wants to grow ephemerals in dry shade?
Well,
Pick one or two.
Okay. Interestingly, even though Virginia bluebells can be found in moist locations in those floodplains, I've found that that particular one grows well under large trees in my dry shade.
Yes,
So
I would second that.
I find that that's a fairly easy one to grow. Spring Beauty seems to grow in a range of conditions. As I mentioned, that's one that can even take some sun. So I think that could be a possibility. May apple, again, grows quite well in my garden. The leaf canopy comes in fairly dense, and so not a lot of rain gets through once that's formed. But again, the May apple does quite well for me. I have to admit, I don't have a lot of personal experience growing the trilliums, but as you saw on the slides, it was suggested that those be provided sufficient moisture, so those might not be the best choice.
There was a question about how many types of hepatica grow in Northern Virginia.
Well, I noted these two, the round-lobed and the sharp-lobed. There may be others, and I will be happy to look further into that.
All right, thanks, Elaine. There's someone in our audience who is planning a large installation of ephemerals and wants to know if there are any particular vendors that you think would handle that better.
I guess it depends on where this person is calling in from. In Northern Virginia, the Plant Nova native site is outstanding. They will have links not just to native sellers right up here, literally in Northern Virginia, but a little further afield. And they also have indications of seasonal sales by native vendors. And those will be beginning fairly soon. In fact, here, our own unit of Master Gardeners will be having a sale locally on April 19. And some of those vendors, I think, could provide fairly large numbers of plants.
Okey doke. And I think our final question, someone wanted to know if you had recommendations for ephemerals to plant under red maples with shallow competing roots.
Well, as I've mentioned at the outset, the rooting systems of ephemerals in general tend to be fairly shallow, but I can take a few moments to look specifically for those exact conditions and provide that information in the addendum document.
Thanks a lot, Elaine. The thanks are pouring in. Everybody enjoyed this immensely, as did I. And so thank you for this lovely talk today.
You're very welcome, everyone. And with that, I wish you all happy gardening.